I have read and listened to several Dogman encounters over the years since I had my own personal experience, and the vast majority of them seem to have one common thread. They happen outdoors, and, although admittedly terrifying, the creature ultimately runs away without usually ever causing any physical harm to said witness. And, whilst I am obviously thrilled that these people have managed to escape untouched, I feel the need to enlighten your listeners that not everybody is as lucky. And one of those unlucky people is me. You see, a few years back, I had my very own encounter with a Dogman. At the time, I didn't realize exactly what this creature was. Only instead of discovering a humanoid creature with a dog's head in the woods, at some distance, or a blurry nighttime sighting through a car window as you whiz past something unusual, this happened in my own home. I live in Texas. The house I have is pretty big, but by my own admission, it really needs some work, and one day, I might get around to that. But let's just say for now, there are a few rooms that look like they've been burglarized, even though nobody has been in there. I'm not proud, but I did inherit this place and all that crap that came with it, and, well, just haven't had the time or inclination to sort it out yet. This is relevant, I promise. Just keep on track with me. So, on the day in question, when I heard a crash from one of the rooms at the very back of the house, I wasn't instantly concerned. My mind did not go straight to an intruder, and definitely not to a monster. I'm a practical guy, if not much of a housekeeper. The first thing I thought was that maybe a pile of crap had fallen over. You see, I'd inherited this place from a great uncle, and to say he was a hoarder was a big understatement. I swear, he'd kept every darn newspaper that he had ever been delivered to him. So, to be honest, things were always toppling over, and at most, I thought it could have been some sort of critter, like a raccoon, maybe. Nothing I was particularly concerned over. If my potential housemate was of the furry variety, I would consider my options. But, as I said, I wasn't scared. So, I wandered through the place and checked in the various rooms to see if I could discover the source of noise, or notice an avalanche of papers amongst the other carnage. That was when I heard another very distinct crash, followed by what sounded like snuffling or grunting from the room next door. I was still not remotely frightened at this point. It was more a case of what now? Opening the door to that room, though, I didn't see it to start with. As with most of the rooms, they were in such disarray. Piles of stuff covered up to the windows too, so there was very little light, and being a very old house, the bare bulb on the ceiling was nearly useless. The first thing I noticed in this room was that it was very, very cold, which then led my attention to the window, which I could see now had been clearly broken. Now, I was starting to feel the suggestion of something being off, but I still wouldn't equate the feeling of fear. Not yet. More annoyance, I suppose, as now I would have to fix that window. I could just about make out where the stacks of books in this case had been knocked over, and located the snuffling sound to the far corner of the room. At this stage, it was still a snuffly grunt. I do recall thinking it sounded like a boar, and then dismissing it immediately, as how the hell would a darn pig jump through a pane of glass? I began to creep over, really just intending to find out what critter I was dealing with, and whether I could chase it out myself, or needed to call for some sort of assistance. I wasn't scared of raccoons or anything like that, but you don't want one hanging off your arm, as they do got sharp little teeth, especially if they feel threatened. I got around halfway across the room when it decided to show itself. It had been crouching behind the books, and now, as this thing reared up, it stood not only taller than the highest precarious pile of paperbacks, but almost reached my height. And I'm 6'2". Yeah, now I was starting to feel afraid. Real afraid. Because the first thing that sprang to my mind was that I was dealing with a human intruder in a mask. And humans can do damage as if they're brave enough to enter your house in daylight. And they're likely out of their minds on PCP or something. And, like all Texans, I have a gun, but it was upstairs in my bedside cabinet. I started to back away, as I'm not an idiot or a hero. When it crashed through the debris, it shoved me hard in my chest, knocking me to the floor. I could see now that this wasn't a human intruder. This was something much, much worse. Although it was tall and stood on its legs just like a person, that was as human as it got. The body, which was shredded and very muscular, was completely covered in dark, thick fur. It had long arms just like a person, but with huge hand-like paws instead of human hands. And at the end of the paws, as my bleeding chest could attest, were razor-sharp claws. And then was its head. Now, as I said, I had first assumed it was somebody in a mask, a very realistic dog-like mask. But as it looked down on me, growling, I could clearly see this was not a costume. This hairy bipedal beast had a head like a Doberman pinscher, resplendent with pointy ears, tiny little beady eyes, and a very overly large snout. Oh, and it appeared to be frothing furious, with a large tongue. I'm not too afraid to admit that I screamed. A full-on final girl scream, shriek, that any female would have been proud of. It answered this by arching its head back and howling this inhuman noise. The single most terrifying noise that I have ever in my life heard. Looking down at me, a mere helpless victim lying in wait on the floor for it to finish me, it swiped at me again with those same claws, and then off it went, crashing back through the broken window from whence it came. Somehow, I managed in my fear to crawl to my phone and call 911 before I lost consciousness. The doctors managed to patch up my chest, although I have some stellar scars. I did lose my arm though. Its claws had all but severed it, and they were unable to sew it back in time. I told police exactly what happened. I even saw their faces as they made notes. They came and inspected the house, ran some quote-unquote tests, but I know they didn't believe me. They basically just concluded that it must have been a freak wild animal attack, possibly a coyote. Well, I'm here to tell you now, that wasn't no darn coyote, and I have the scars to prove it. It's taken me almost an hour to write this up, just using my left hand, since that coyote that crashed through my window ripped off my writing hand. I just hope this story helps you and your listeners be as vigilant as possible. These things don't just happen at night or in the woods. These dogmen are becoming braver, and they are now breaking into buildings, killing people, harming people. It's terrible, and they're not afraid of daylight either. Be very aware. Sometimes, as a police officer, you get to witness things that regular people couldn't even imagine in your wildest dreams, or nightmares. We often get hit with gagging orders and have to sign contracts to promise we won't tell. It goes on way more than you think, and it isn't just about sleazy politicians or screwed up celebrities. No, sometimes this is full-on Men in Black stuff. I kid you not. I have seen many things that I will file under Unexplained. However, there is one thing that I will break my code of silence for, as it was the weirdest and scariest thing I have ever seen yet. And people need to know about this stuff. Now, to try and keep my anonymity, I'm not going to disclose what city or even what state this is in. Rest assured, I have it on good faith that this happens all over the U.S. anyway. I was on an evening patrol when I got a call to attend a disturbance in the woods nearby, possibly a suicide. Now, no one likes this kind of call. Not only does it never get easy to find somebody like that, but even as a seasoned officer, I hate relaying death messages to family, especially when somebody has chosen to end their life. Apparently, a dog walker had been minding their own business when they noticed a pair of feet swinging from a tree. They couldn't make out much more, as it was getting too dark, and I doubt they wanted to. Death by hanging ain't a nice way to go, so they did themselves a huge favor by not investigating further and dialing 911, just like a good Samaritan should. So, I prepared myself for the inevitable. The state of the body, the stench, as they always void their bowels at the end, headed over to the location, a standard issue leading the way. Sure enough, I soon came across the feet swinging from the tree, just as the witness had described. Only what they had admitted, or perhaps what their mind had not allowed them to process, was that the feet were hairy and had claws, and they belonged to an equally hairy body, which led right up to an equally hairy head, which in the light from my light looked like a dog. I was looking what can only be described as either a really tall dog with a human-like body and limbs, or a Wolfman. Now, I realized that things can look distorted in the dark, and looking up at a body with its neck all stretched out can impede what you are actually seeing. And of course, it could have been a person in a Halloween costume and a really good mask, right? Well, I have never seen anything as lifelike and detailed, if that was the case. But there was no way in hell I was touching the body right then. I called it in for the CSI, using our on-air code, for it might be something unusual. Within minutes, another unit arrived and began to cordon off the area. I was thanked for my time, reminded of the procedures, and asked to leave, which I happily and promptly did, but not before seeing that body after they cut it down and put it in the bag. I'll never know what happened in the investigation, as I don't have that kind of clearance. I don't know whether the thing was killed, or what, or if somebody else caught it and then strung it up. All I do know is that this was in no way an elaborate costume or a prank. The head was near sheared off from the tightness of that rope, and the gore and meat exposed showed that thing was real. It was a dead werewolf, if I do say so myself. I don't believe in that stuff, but I cannot refute or deny what I saw in person. It was terrifying to say the least, and goes hands down as probably one of the scariest things I've ever encountered as an officer. This is a fairly short story, but true nonetheless. I don't have many details, as I sure as hell didn't hang around or even go back to verify what I'd seen. But essentially, here's the crux of it. A few weeks ago, I was driving home from college to spend a few days back home with my family. Although the drive was only a few hours, I had gotten caught up with a late meeting with one of the professors and was therefore running behind. And at the time, it was already dark. Even though I'm almost 21, my mom still made me check in each hour to let her know I was okay and how much further I had to go. Around the halfway mark, I had come off the highway and traveled through some lesser used roads until I got back onto a main road, which would lead all the way into town that I lived in. I had driven this route many times and was not concerned. It was quite dark by now, but it was a clear night, so I could still see pretty good. My dad obsessed with me hitting like a moose or something. After all, we live in Maine. So, I was focused on being super vigilant as usual. I had my lights on. I was taking it steady, both hands on the wheel. And that's when I saw something I can't explain. Now, we all have sorts of beasties up here, as parts of the state are beautiful woodland and thick, rich forest. But it's unusual to encounter something if you are not off the beaten path. Even though this was a country road, I was by no means in the middle of the forest or out in the sticks, as many people like to say. So, my first thought as I approached it was that it was a dog, someone's pet even, that had ran away from one of the farms maybe. It was crouched at the side of the road, facing away from me. But as I drove closer, it turned in my direction, and then did something I'll never forget. Stood up on two legs. This dog on the roadside stood up, just the same as a person would, from a crouching position. And I was surprised by just how tall it was. I'm not gonna lie, I was freaking out so bad, I put my foot on the gas and sped the hell out of there. I couldn't help myself from looking as I passed, and the only way I could describe it was that it was a really tall, upright, dog. It was furry, and definitely had a dog face. But even when my granddaddy's German Shepherd used to put its paws on granddaddy's shoulders, it was still very much a dog's body, especially the way it arched over. Dogs can't really stand up straight. You know how that is. Well, this looked like a hairy man, but with the face of a dog. It even had the same legs that a person does, and not bent like a dog's. In fact, its entire physique was that of a human, just covered in thick hair, kind of like a bear. When I got home and told my parents, once I'd promised that I had not been drinking or smoking weed or anything, they rationalized that it must have been a bear, just because of the size. I'm not 100% sure that wasn't no bear. Maybe a Yeti. I honestly don't know. What I do know is that I added an hour onto my journey back to college to avoid that particular stretch of road. And if you want to call this a misidentification, I'm here to tell you that when I drove by, I got a good look at the face, and I know what bears look like. That by no means was the face of a bear, nor the head. Its shape was very unique compared to that of a bear, and resembled far more a canine than it did an actual bear. I hope this clears up any discrepancies that my story might give you. Although I have never seen a cryptid or anything like that, I do remember this one that happened when I went camping with my parents and my two older brothers when I was just a kid. My parents always put it down to us winding each other up and having overactive imaginations, and reading far too much Goosebumps. But we know what we heard. And just a few months ago, now that we are all adults, my mother finally admitted to us that she had heard it too, but had pretended not to so as to keep us from having nightmares. Not that it worked. I dreamt about that noise for years, and even more so, what made that noise. But anyway, so, it was just a typical campsite near some woods, and we were pitched there for just a couple of nights. Things had been great, for the most part. We'd climbed trees, played baseball, told stories, and enjoyed campfire food and fun. You know, s'mores, hot dogs, junk food, the essentials that many kids live on when camping. It was the second of nights when I woke up, desperate to go pee. Now, I wasn't a scaredy cat, but also, I was only 9, and it was pitch black outside. My brothers and I were in one tent, Mom and Dad in the other. Mom had pleaded with us that if we had to go pee in the woods during the night, we at least go over to the trees, so she wasn't stepping or smelling our urine the next morning. My brothers, we'll call them Luke and Justin, were both fast asleep, and I was of course not wanting to wake them. So, I began to fumble my way out of the tent. Of course, I stumbled and managed to trip over Luke, who bolted up and gave me a death stare for waking him. You know how older brothers are. But they weren't bad brothers, and he said since he was awake now anyway, he'd keep watch at the tent flap for me. I hurried out, and just as I was finished and about to run back is when I heard the sound. A howl. But, and this is the important and freaky part, it tapered off into more like a scream. Can you even imagine just how frightening, terrifying it was? Thank God I finished my flow, or I swear, I would have pissed all over myself. As it was, I then raced back into the tent, knocking Luke over again in the process. Looking at his wide eyes, I knew he had heard it too. I mean, how couldn't you have? It was so loud. What was, I was about to ask when we heard it again. Part howl, part scream. It was like it started off as a really low-pitched howl, kind of like a wolf, and then changed halfway through the scream of the duration into this deep guttural human scream. And the scream, by the way, lasted at least 10 seconds. What the hell had the kind of lung power to make that noise? Luke was shaking by now. Even though he was only 11, he was always the most sensitive of all of us. We've got another fright. Then as Justin appeared right behind us and whispered, "What the hell was that?" So he had heard it too. Zipping up the tent, we all huddled together, Luke trying not to cry, as I whispered as quietly as I could what had happened. Justin was 12, and our biggest brother and hero, but even he looked genuinely petrified. We couldn't think of a single creature or animal that could make up such a horrendous noise. Then, we heard some snuffling and movement right outside of the tent. I honestly, hand on heart, thought we were all about to die. Luke could not cope anymore and let out an ear-piercing scream, almost matching that which we had heard outside. Of course, that was enough to wake Mom and Dad, and the next thing we knew, the tent was being unzipped by my dad, in his PJs, looking not the happiest. Once they realized how scared we were, and that it wasn't some elaborate prank, we all slept piled into one tent. Well, I say slept, although I'm not sure anyone actually did. More like we just waited until the sun came up and drove out of there. For years after, Mom and Dad said it was most likely some sort of wild female dog, that they can make a screaming noise when they are searching for a mate. Keep in mind, my parents are far from any sort of biology degree, so I always like to give my mom crap for it, like she just pulled the answer out of her butt. And as I said, it is only recently that Mom finally admitted they did in fact believe us. And the reason was, as they heard Luke scream, my dad quickly turned on his powerful torch, which was right next to him, and the light reflected a shadow just outside the tent for just a second. And that shadow was as tall as a man. But the thing that scared my father the most, and he will even argue now, that it must just have been a trick of the light. The thing that shook him up the most was the shape of the shadow's head, because just for that fleeting moment, it resembled a dog. I thought that I would for sure be sending you a story related to UFOs and aliens, but that was before the story had finished unfolding. I'm a long-time listener, and I love your show. I can't say I've ever fancied encountering any of the things that you report on. It's my good pleasure, and my misfortune, to be submitting this experience of mine to you. I own a very small farm in the rural areas of Indiana. Describing the landscape would be pointless. You look in any direction, and there's corn. Big surprise. Maybe enough open space for a road, but your view is dominated by corn. That's it. People like me make some extra room for hogs and cattle. A few will even have some sheep, which isn't me. I'm an army of one. This last winter, I came outside to a massacre in the pasture. I don't think there are bears here in Indiana. I mean, I think there might be black bears, but nothing large enough to do this kind of damage. It looked like a bear had gotten in among the cows and torn several of them apart. They weren't just ripped open, like a pack of wolves descending upon a weak animal and ripping their guts out. They were, and this may not be the right word, dismantled. Joints were severed and ripped. Heads removed. Ribs were cracked and splayed open. Almost like that blood eagle thing that the Vikings used to do. Internal organs were ground up or tossed every which way, just like dirty laundry. It was the kind of violence you look at, and you think that there was more to it than some wild-looking thing just for a meal. It looked like the sort of thing that a crazed drug addict would do during an overdose. It was intelligent carnage. Does that even make any sense? Anyway, you get the picture. Most of the herd was untouched, but they were very spooked and acted nervous. They were looking at me warily, as if another new threat could possibly come from me. That was my clue that it had been a human, and not an animal that had done this to my cows, especially the way my cows looked at me. This meant that I would have to check the cattle regularly now that I've sighted, and that would be more time that I did not have to take away from my other daily chores. Walking away at regular intervals to burn precious time, checking to see if there's something for me to shoot in the pasture. Days passed, and my vigil turned up nothing. No cattle thief or poachers. No meth heads. No back alley butchers in training, trying to sneak in some extra credit. And of course, no space aliens or UFOs, or little green-gray men. Of course, it was when I decided not to keep up on my patrolling that something happened. 4 of my cows were shredded and strewn everywhere. I was honestly at a point where I would either have to start living next to the pasture in a tent, or pay someone to be my cow security guard. Chores were now piling up, and the time it took to be checking in with my moo-moos every 15 to 20 minutes was really becoming unrealistic. I found a middle ground, and I bought a trail cam. I would best be able to take care of the problem if I got a good look at the problem itself. For all I knew, my cows were spontaneously combusting, and I was just chasing shadows. It would be another week before I found more of my cows looking like they had been falling into a blender. I checked the trail cam, and it had indeed been tripped. So, I took the box out and had a look. It was bad enough that every animal that appears on a trail cam has glowing eyes. The thing that glared back at me with two eyes, as bright as campfires, is something that I see in my dreams these days, and I probably will for the rest of my life. It looked like a wolf, but it didn't walk like a wolf. It had the posture of a man, meaning it walked on two legs, and even held its arms out in a sinister grace of stealth. To think that such a thing has the freedom and the audacity to roam my land and prey upon my precious animals. It was a whole new level of fear to see this creature, this beast, so close to where I sleep. Judging by the way it stood next to the old oak tree, it was easily 8 or 9 feet tall, what I would consider an absolute monster. It made me wonder if my shotgun would have any stopping power against something like that. That's where the story finds me now, as I write it to you. I think I'll be looking to hire a few hands, specifically for an armed night watch. If anything comes of it, I'll submit to you an update. The only thing that I like more than hiking is, of course, going off the beaten path. I get a thrill off of discovery, and even though man has dominated all but few corners of the wilderness, there's always still something new to see within the boundaries of a timber. I've been hiking the same forest in Montana for years, and I always end up seeing something new, or that things grow in such a way that they look new. Every year, every season, offers a different perspective. This last month, I'm pretty sure I actually found something that I'd never stumbled onto before. You see, I fell. The earth under my feet must not have been able to support me, and I fell into this cavity in the soil. It wasn't like I fell into a super deep pit of doom, Indiana Jones style. The top was only a few feet above my head. Once I was sure that I hadn't broken anything, I felt like a child that had discovered a cave of wonders. It takes a lot to faze me, and I started seeing things that made me feel apprehensive. I fired up my cell phone's LED. The very first thing it revealed was bones. All kinds. Some of which didn't have any business being here in the forest. I know I saw the skulls of cattle, mixed among the squirrel and deer, and even fox bones. There were several sets of canine bones, and that immediately made me wonder what sort of animal had this collection. If even canine, more than likely wolf wasn't the apex predator. It didn't seem like the place a bear would bed down. I did the foolish thing and kept looking around, delving into the darkness, brandishing my pistol, just in case. Besides the bones, I think I saw the most rudimentary forms of habitual dwelling. Skins and furs, serving as crude blankets and bedding. A bone that had been gnawed down into a point, like it could serve as some sort of implement. The tunnel opened underneath a hill, and I was free. My instincts told me to turn around and take one last look before going. I'm glad I did. I may not be alive to write this if I hadn't. An animal that walked on two legs was trotting toward me in that manner, that told me this was meant to be the killing blow. I don't know how long it had stalked me from paces away when I was probing around its suspected home. I can tell you that I remember saliva stringing down from its long fangs, and its dull amber eyes were full of malice. There was nothing human about this. It resembled a large wolf and a man, like some sort of unholy union of a hybrid. But the intensity in those eyes seemed more than the basic kill or be killed programming that one sees in dumb, brute animals. I didn't allow the shock of this thing's sight to paralyze me. I quickly thought and fired 2 shots in its knee and its stomach. It certainly didn't kill it, but the pain seemed to change its mind about coming any closer to me. It gave me one last baleful look before hobbling off, still fast enough to close in and kill. The monster consumed my thoughts for the rest of the day, prompting me to sit down and send you this. I can't tell you if I had encountered a very intelligent animal or a very stupid human. My skin tingles at the idea that these creatures had been a mere few feet away from me under the ground all these years while I roamed the woods. I don't care to meet one again. I'm no Jane Goodall, but the sheer wonder and terror of the natural world, if those things are indeed natural. I don't have much money, but I own a little bit of land with thicker timber. I keep a camper right next to a small, peaceful pond, and that's my getaway when the real-world problems just become too much to take. Sometimes, I'll live out there for weeks at a time, and troubles just seem to be a million miles away when you are sleeping in the heart of nature like that. I kinda got schooled on just how close trouble really is in a nice sanctuary like that. I was getting ready for another stretch of camping. I had gotten a bunch of food and other things and brought it out to the trailer. I would organize it all later on. I still had some things back at the homestead to wrap up before I disappeared. I couldn't have been gone from the trailer for more than late morning to late afternoon, but that was more than enough time for something to happen so that when I showed up, all ready to settle in, it looked like hell dropped a cherry bomb in my toilet. You can see all the way to the mirror when you first open the trailer door, and it was shattered. This was my first hint that not all was well. Then, I saw the way all my clothes and bedding was thrown everywhere. And it wasn't just thrown, it was shredded. Somebody was out to do damage. All the new food I just bought was open and painted onto the walls and carpet. I was getting fighting mad when I noticed the canned goods. I'm a strong man, but not even I can crush a can of beans and cause the insides to be spurting outwards. Every last can I'd bought looked like it had been crushed in the palm of somebody huge and crazy strong. That didn't quite add up with me. I nearly pictured somebody with a tool going around, pinching and bursting all the cans. But that wouldn't make any sense. A little bit of fear and confusion was starting to keep my anger company. I went into what was left of the bedroom and reached under the mattress. My revolver was still there. I just spent the early evening sitting in the doorway of that trailer, waiting for the ransacker to come back. Anyone that causes that much destruction but doesn't take the gun has got to be coming back. I was now starting to doubt if it was a person. But other than bears, what kind of animal has the strength to crush and burst canned goods? I began to doze when a snapping twig made me sit bolt upright. I generally believe in demons from hell all my life, but that was the closest I had ever come to seeing one in the flesh. Damn thing straight up looked like a werewolf, but much more sinister than anything I ever saw in a movie. Its fur was both black and brown, and those ears, man, looked like the devil's horns if I had ever dreamt up such a notion. I thought it was walking on its hind legs, when I noticed its legs were built for being walked on. The monster had actual legs and actual arms. You tell me that ain't straight out of Revelations. I could see twisted metal stuck between its teeth from my cans of food. We locked eyes for a long time, its breath billowing in clouds of vapor with a little grunt each time. It was then that I pointed my gun straight at it and hoped it was smart enough to get the message. It wasn't. It could tell something was up, but it didn't quite get the notion of an armed and pissed off American. So hey, my wall was due for a good trophy. I aimed right between its eyes and pulled the trigger 3 times. The first stunned it. The second and third made bits of bone and meat fly up. I was waiting for it to fall back and die, but it didn't. It ran off, hit a tree in the process, and kept going. When all the adrenaline had worn off, my stubborn bravery went with it. I have no plans of ever going back out to that trailer to sleep alone. What am I, crazy? That would be a death sentence. What that monster did to those cans, it could have easily done to the trailer walls. Just open the entire thing up like a sardine can and eat me alive while I'm snuggled in my bed. I'll keep the 12 gauge within my arm's reach at all times from now on. And maybe you can answer me, what exactly in the hell am I dealing with here? Once, and only once, did I get the chance to be a part of a dig site at the ruins of a Mayan temple in Honduras. I was all over that. After all the business with 2012 and the Mayan calendar, I was hooked, to say the least. So, I readily took the invitation without a thought or second of hesitation. The director of the dig was going to focus less on the ruins above ground and take a closer look at what could be beneath the ground. He didn't think it likely that the Mayans just kept their secrets out in the open, so he wanted to probe underneath, wherever there might be crypts and secret storage. His intuition did not disappoint. We discovered 3 more crypts than what had originally been discovered. All of them cleverly hidden. It took months to move the dirt and rocks out while preserving the precious stonework. Things got even more interesting when we started unearthing walls and tablets that had consistent depictions of something that looked like it was borrowed from ancient Egypt. Bipedal wolves were shown in carvings to be corralling, almost shepherding groups of people. There were some indications that they were supposed to be criminals. I could picture an ancient society throwing criminals to wolves, but we were all tripping over the depiction of the wolves walking just like humans. Someone suggested that it was a visual metaphor, an executioner having wolf-like traits, but there were too many relief carvings of these same depictions. There was nothing with the familiar wolf that walks on all 4s. The matter came to a head when we uncovered a door in the floor, a heavy stone slab that was utterly covered in depictions of the same man-wolf. The mechanism that allowed the door to open was, in fact, intact. Once the lock was removed, it took only 1 finger to make the door slide open, thanks to some sophisticated, ancient ball-bearing system. Stairs descended into a depth none of us could really make out. The director volunteered himself and 2 others to go down and investigate. I was appalled that I wasn't chosen, but the director argued that somebody had to make sure it was safe first. I waited in front of the yawning doorway, eager to have my own turn. At length, I heard a sound that curdled my blood. A long, echoing howl drifted out of the opening, as if it were coming from very far away. Several others followed. It was easily the eeriest sensation, and the whole of my skin prickled. A while later, the director and only one of his companions would come, racing out of the hole, wide-eyed. He gibbered about how we needed to close the doorway and seal it immediately. When I refused, he punched me in the jaw and did the job himself. I was far too stunned from the punch to hit him back. Everything else happened far too quickly for anybody to react. The expedition was abandoned. Records thrown away, quote-unquote disappeared, though I'm sure the director didn't destroy them. They were more than likely ceased. Everyone was ordered home, and those that couldn't cut their trip short were put up in hotels until they could leave appropriately. I wanted answers. I couldn't get a hold of a single person to get any. The director changed all of his contact information. Facebook information from the few people I had gotten to know at the dig site, well, vanished. The entire thing was covered up. I know you were hoping for some big story about a real-life monster encounter, but I wasn't given my chance. That howling that I'd heard rising up from that secret vault, that was no air movement. I'm thoroughly convinced that was something very much wolf or dog related. I can only guess what spooked the director and claimed one of our associates. I thought that was rather cold of him to just leave without the third man, but maybe there wasn't anything left to go back for. I would have brought it up with the law if the entire expedition hadn't vanished into thin air, and any trace of the trip, on record or paper, now gone. I later wondered if the authorities knew more than I ever would, and if they helped in making it look like there was never an expedition. Now, I'm far away out of that job field, and I pursue other areas in life, leaving that in the past, where I feel it belongs. I'm a sanitation worker. You'd be amazed at how much the local wildlife becomes part of the ecology of a landfill. Buzzards, coyotes, sometimes wolves, and even the occasional bear will show up to see what edibles have been left behind by humans. I have an entire Instagram account devoted to the wildlife I can photograph. Junkyards are all that pretty, but it seems like a wasted opportunity, no pun intended. One early morning, I thought I had scored a good view on the biggest and most dangerous-looking black wolf that I had ever laid my eyes upon. It was by itself on a hill of trash, gnawing on the cadaver of a deer. I got out my camera and everything as he just stayed there like a good boy. Once I got everything mounted on a tripod and got the wolf in my viewfinder, the creature, well, stood up. I thought I was going to find out that one of my coworkers had pranked me, and he'd turn around, and I'd see him wearing a wolf Halloween costume. But when he turned around, there was no laughing face of my friend. There was just the wolf's face, the eyes alive with a light that made my spirit shrivel up like a raisin. I quickly snapped back to my senses, fumbled for the camera, wanting to capture evidence of this sighting. For the first time since owning that camera, it wouldn't take. I cursed at it and exclaimed. The monster just stood there like it knew what was happening, as if it were amused. Then, the camera just died. The wolf, or whatever it was, let out a shuddering, guttural growl that almost sounded like a laugh, a mocking taunt. Looking back, I realized that it could have attacked me, and I wouldn't have been able to put up an ounce of a fight. Maybe the deer satiated it. Maybe it wanted to hang around. Of course, nobody now believes me when I tell them this story. So, I'm sending it to you, in hopes you can give me some answers.